The words hit Ella Mercer like a stone to the chest, spoken so quietly against the dying light that she almost thought she had imagined them. She stood at the edge of the bluff, the whole burning canvas of the Arizona sky stretched out before her, and the man beside her had just cracked open something so private, so raw, that she could feel the weight of it pressing against her ribs. Martin Garrison did not look at her when he said it. He kept his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was bleeding itself out in rivers of copper and violet, and his voice came out low and certain and terribly honest. "I have watched that sunset every night alone until you stood here." And the terrible thing, the thing that made Ella's throat lock tight and her hands curl into fists at her sides, was that she had almost left that morning. She had almost packed her single traveling trunk, climbed up onto the supply wagon with old Reed Halsey, and ridden back toward Flagstaff without a single word of goodbye. She had her reasons. God, she had her reasons. They felt solid as granite when she had been standing in her small room at dawn, folding her dresses with shaking hands, and telling herself that staying would only deepen a wound that had no business existing in the first place. Yet here she stood, rooted to the red earth, the warm evening air moving through the loose strands of her brown hair, listening to a man who never wasted words spend 6 of them to say something that undid every careful argument she had made against him. She had arrived in Cascade Flats 6 weeks earlier under circumstances that were already complicated and growing more so by the hour. She had not come for Martin Garrison. She had come because she had no other honest choice, and that distinction mattered enormously to her, even now. But arriving in a place under desperation and staying for reasons of the heart were 2 entirely different things, and somewhere in the weeks between her first difficult morning on this high desert plateau and this impossible dusk, the line between those 2 things had blurred beyond recognition. To understand what Martin's words meant, and what they cost him to say, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the dust-choked morning Ella Mercer stepped off the southbound stage in Cascade Flats, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1882, with a leather satchel in one hand and a letter in the other, and trouble already following her shadow like a second skin. Cascade Flats sat in the high desert country of northern Arizona Territory, a town built more from necessity than ambition. It had a main street of sun-bleached timber buildings, a general store run by a widow named Arlene Potts, a small post office attached to the livery, a saloon called the Copper Crown, and a sheriff's office that doubled as the town jail whenever the need arose. There was a church with a crooked steeple that the congregation kept meaning to straighten and never quite got around to. And beyond the church, the land opened up into rangeland that rolled toward distant mesas in every direction. The soil was red and ancient, the sky enormous, and the wind that came off the high desert at night carried a chill that surprised people who had never spent time at elevation. It was into this spare and unforgiving landscape that Ella Mercer arrived carrying secrets she was not yet ready to name. She was 26 years old, which in that year and that territory meant she was past the age when most women in small frontier towns had already established themselves as wives or daughters or schoolteachers. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned practically at the back of her neck, green eyes that tended to see more than she let on, and a quality of self-containment that some people read as coldness and others, the more perceptive ones, recognized as the particular stillness of a person who has learned that the world does not reward open vulnerability. She had come from St. Louis, or more accurately, she had fled St. Louis, and the distinction between arriving somewhere and fleeing somewhere has a way of coloring everything that follows. The letter in her hand was from a lawyer named Grover Stills, and it informed her that she had inherited a parcel of land on the outskirts of Cascade Flats from her late uncle, a man named Francis Mercer who had gone west in the 1870s to make his fortune, and had died 3 months prior with a cattle lease, 47 acres of mediocre rangeland, and no family closer than Ella. The letter said the land came with an outstanding debt to a man named Dale Colton, a local rancher of some standing, and that Ella would need to present herself to the Territorial Land Office within 60 days to establish her claim, or the land would revert to creditors. Ella had no particular attachment to the land itself. What she had was a pressing need to be somewhere that was not St. Louis, a small inheritance from her mother that she had been carefully protecting for 2 years, and the calculating intelligence to understand that 47 acres in Arizona Territory, even mediocre acres, represented something she desperately needed: a foothold, a place to plant herself that nobody from her previous life could easily reach. Her previous life, the life she was running from, involved a man named Victor Harlan who had presented himself to her in St. Louis as a successful merchant, had courted her with considerable charm for 8 months, and had turned out to be neither successful nor a merchant in any legitimate sense. Victor Harlan ran numbers for the St. Louis criminal underground, had connections to 3 separate gambling dens, and when Ella had discovered this and ended their engagement, he had made it very clear that he did not consider the engagement ended. He had made it clear in a way that left bruising on her wrist and a very specific quality of fear lodged in her chest that she carried with her all the way to Arizona. She had told no one, not the authorities, because Victor had people in low positions throughout the St. Louis police structure. Not her friends, because frightened women who talked too much had a way of becoming a trail that could be followed. She had packed what she could carry, collected her mother's inheritance from the bank 3 weeks before Victor expected it, and she had used that money to get herself as far from St. Louis as the letter from Grover Stills gave her any logical reason to go. The stage from Flagstaff deposited her in Cascade Flats at 9:30 in the morning, and the first thing she noticed, beyond the heat and the red dust that immediately began settling on her traveling clothes, was that the town watched strangers with the particular attention of a small community that did not receive many of them. The second thing she noticed was that the lawyer's office was closed, with a handwritten note tacked to the door informing anyone who cared that Grover Stills had ridden out to the Garrison Ranch on business and would return by noon. The Garrison Ranch. That was the first time she heard the name. She took her trunk to the boarding house run by a woman named Clara Hinz, who was 60 and direct, and who gave Ella a small room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced west, which Ella would later understand was significant. She washed the road dust from her face, pinned her hair back into order, and walked to the general store to wait for the lawyer in some semblance of comfort. Arlene Potts, the woman behind the counter of the general store, had the gift of being informative without appearing to gossip. In the course of selling Ella a tin of crackers and a small jar of preserves, she managed to convey an extraordinary amount of local knowledge. She explained that Cascade Flats had about 200 residents, that the territory sheriff out of Flagstaff came through once a month if they were lucky, that the local cattle industry was dominated by 2 operations, and that there was ongoing, low-grade tension between them. The first operation belonged to Dale Colton, who ran the Colton Cattle Company out of a large ranch on the eastern side of the valley. Dale Colton was in his mid-50s, prosperous, politically connected to the territorial legislature, and widely regarded as a man who preferred to get what he wanted through legal pressure rather than direct confrontation, though the distinction blurred at the edges. The second operation, significantly smaller but consistently solvent, was the Garrison Cattle Company, which belonged to Martin Garrison. Arlene Potts said the name with a particular quality of respect, the kind that doesn't require embellishment. Martin Garrison had inherited the ranch at 22 when his father died of a fever, had spent the subsequent 8 years building it into something legitimate through work that Arlene described simply as unrelenting, and was now 30 years old, quiet as stone, and apparently the source of some civic fascination among the unmarried women of Cascade Flats and the surrounding area, none of whom had made any discernible progress. "He is not unfriendly," Arlene said carefully. "He is simply a man who keeps to himself." Ella filed all of this away without comment and ate her crackers and waited for the lawyer. Grover Stills arrived at his office at 12:15, a small, efficient man in a coat that was slightly too large for him, and he walked her through the terms of the inheritance with the brisk practicality of someone who had seen enough frontier legal disputes to hold no romantic notions about property. The 47 acres were real. The debt to Dale Colton was also real, a promissory note her uncle had signed in 1880 for a sum of $420, which had been accumulating interest for 2 years. The current amount owed, with interest, was $580. Ella had her mother's inheritance. She had managed to bring $800 with her from St. Louis. Paying the debt would leave her with $220, the 47 acres, a small cabin on the property that her uncle had built, and no clear plan for what came next. But the mathematics of it were manageable, and Ella was good at mathematics. What Grover Stills told her next was not in the letter, and it was this that moved the situation from complicated to potentially catastrophic. He told her, in the careful way of a man choosing his words to stay just inside the truth, that Dale Colton had expressed strong interest in acquiring the Mercer parcel, that his interest had been expressed in advance of her uncle's death, which had struck some people in town as curious, that the note Colton held was technically in violation of the original terms, because Francis Mercer had made a partial payment 18 months prior that had not been properly credited against the principal, and that if Ella chose to contest this, she had a legal argument, but she would need to make it to a land office judge in Flagstaff, and Dale Colton had friends in Flagstaff. She sat very still through all of this. Then she asked whether there was anyone in Cascade Flats who could be relied upon to give her an honest assessment of the situation. Grover Stills looked at her for a moment, seemed to decide she was serious, and said, "Martin Garrison." She went to the Garrison ranch the following morning. She had not sent word ahead because she did not know how, and so when she arrived at the gate of the property on a borrowed horse from Clara Hind's stable, she found a man in the far field working with a post digger, and it took her a moment to understand that this was him. He was tall, built with the particular density of someone who worked outdoors in all weather, with dark hair under a dusty hat and forearms that showed the kind of muscle that came from actual labor rather than performance of it. He saw her at the gate, finished setting the post he was working on, and walked across the field toward her with the unhurried pace of a man who did not treat urgency as a virtue. He had dark eyes, she noticed when he came close enough, and they had the quality she had noticed in very few people. They looked at you without performing the act of looking. There was no calculation in them, no social measurement. He simply looked, and you felt seen in a way that was both comfortable and slightly unsettling. "Miss Mercer," he said, not a question. She blinked. "You know who I am. Word travels." He removed his hat, which was the gesture of a man raised with manners, and ran a hand through his dark hair. "You inherited Francis Mercer's parcel." "I did. I was told you might be willing to give me an honest opinion about a legal situation." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "Come in out of the sun," and she followed him to the shaded porch of a farmhouse that was well kept in a functional way, not pretty, but solid. Everything about the property had that quality, solid, maintained, purposeful. He poured her water from a ceramic pitcher and listened without interruption while she explained the situation with Colton's note and the missed payment credit. When she finished, he was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably only half a minute. "Colton wants your parcel because the eastern edge of it runs along Red Rock Creek," he said. "That creek feeds his summer grazing. Right now he has a verbal arrangement with your uncle that gave him grazing rights in dry seasons. If you own that land and you don't honor that arrangement, he loses a significant portion of his summer range." So the debt is leverage, Ella said. That is one way to describe it. What is your way? He looked at her steadily. It is a trap. He said it before your uncle died, and he is counting on you not knowing the territory well enough to see the way around it. The word trap landed with weight. She felt it precisely. Is there a way around it? The partial payment your uncle made, if you can document it, reduces the outstanding debt and changes the terms of the note. The original agreement also had a land use clause that Colton has been violating for 2 years by running cattle on the creek bed itself rather than the grazing land adjacent to it. That is a separate leverage point. How do you know all of this? For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. Because your uncle told me about 6 months before he died. He knew the note was coming due and he didn't have the money. We talked about options. Why would he talk to you? Because I am the only person in this valley who does not need anything from him and does not want his land. She turned her water glass in her hands. Why don't you want it? The creek access would benefit you too. It would, he agreed. That is not what I am interested in. She waited for him to say what he was interested in, and he didn't, which she would later understand was simply his way. He did not perform his interior life for an audience. He said what was necessary and let the rest stand in silence, and that particular quality would take her several weeks to learn to read properly. He offered to let her use a parcel of his own land to graze the 3 cattle her uncle had left, so that she would have something generating income while she sorted out the legal situation. He offered this without elaboration or apparent expectation, as a practical solution to a practical problem, and she accepted it in the same spirit because she could not afford not to. She walked back to her borrowed horse with the feeling that something significant had just happened, though she could not yet say what. The weeks that followed were a slow and complicated negotiation on several fronts simultaneously. On one front, Ella was dealing with Dale Colton, who came to call at Clara Hint's boarding house 3 days after her arrival, and sat across the parlor table from her, with the polished affability of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the appearance of generosity. He was broad-shouldered and gray-haired, and he smelled of bay rum and money, and he offered her $400 for the parcel and the grazing rights, which was $160 less than the debt he claimed she owed. He framed this as doing her a favor. Ella looked at him pleasantly and said she needed time to consider and would be in touch, and she walked directly from that meeting to the post office to send a letter to Flagstaff about the partial payment documentation her uncle had supposedly kept in the land office records there. On a second front, she was navigating the social texture of Cascade Flats, which was not difficult in itself, but required a particular kind of attention. Small towns in 1882 Arizona territory ran on reputation and relationship in ways that larger cities did not, and a woman alone, neither wife nor widow nor clearly passing through, occupied an ambiguous position that required careful management. Clara Hintz was helpful here, an ally of practical rather than sentimental bent who seemed to take a dim view of Dale Colton for reasons she never elaborated on, and who introduced Ella around town with the straightforward endorsement of a woman who was honest about both the introduction and its limits. On a third front, which she had not anticipated, and which was by far the most disorienting, she was spending increasing amounts of time at the Garrison Ranch. It started functionally. She needed to check on her uncle's cattle, which were grazing on Martin's land. She needed to discuss the ongoing situation with Colton. She needed access to the land records Martin kept in a neat ledger in his office, which detailed 20 years of grazing arrangements and water use in the valley. But function has a way of becoming habit before you notice the transition, and habit has a way of becoming something else before you are prepared for that either. Martin Garrison was not a man who talked easily, but he was a man who talked honestly, and Ella discovered that those two qualities, which she had always thought were different points on the same scale, were in fact entirely separate things. He could go long stretches in silence, and the silence around him was not uncomfortable but something closer to companionable, a quiet that he seemed to inhabit naturally rather than impose on a space. But when he did speak, he said what he meant with a directness that she found increasingly valuable after months of careful management of Victor Harlan's mutable truths. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. She would ride out in the late morning, they would deal with whatever practical matter required attention, and then there was frequently something else, a fence that needed assessing, a section of the creek boundary that was worth walking, an unexpected complication with the cattle that required 2 pairs of eyes. She was not naive enough to think that all of these additional tasks were strictly necessary. She suspected some of them were not. She was not sure which of them was generating the surplus of reasons to stay longer, and that uncertainty itself was interesting to her. He showed her the land with the particular quality of someone who had paid close attention to a place for a long time. He knew where the water ran and where it didn't, where the soil changed character between the red clay sections and the sandy washes, which sections of his rangeland would be underwater if they had a bad monsoon season, and which would hold. He talked about these things without poetry, in the flat, factual language of a man who understood land as a practical reality rather than a romantic concept. But she heard the love in it anyway, the way a person can love something and speak of it plainly, and that love still comes through in the precision of the knowledge. What she did not know, what she would not know for several more weeks, was what Martin Garrison thought of her. He was courteous. He was consistently helpful in ways that she could not have managed without, which created a complicated relationship to gratitude that she was still untangling. He looked at her with those attentive, unperforming eyes. He listened when she spoke with a quality of attention that was increasingly rare in her experience of men. But he said nothing that crossed the border from helpful neighbor into anything else, and she was not entirely sure whether this was because nothing was there to say or because he was a man who guarded what he said with extreme care. She thought about this more than was probably wise. The situation with Dale Colton moved from pressure to threat in the 3rd week of her arrival. The documentation she had requested from the Flagstaff Land Office arrived and confirmed what Grover Stills had suggested, that Francis Mercer had indeed made a partial payment in the amount of $80 18 months prior, and that payment had not been credited to the outstanding note. This reduced the legitimate debt to $500 and change, rather than $580, and more importantly, it called into question the validity of the note's current terms. Ella took this documentation to Grover Stills, who confirmed its implications with the careful precision of a lawyer, and then she made an appointment to speak with Dale Colton directly. That meeting did not go well. Colton, faced with the documentation, did not become angry, which would have been easier to manage. He became cold. He told her, in a quiet that reminded her uncomfortably of Victor Harlan's quiet, that she was a woman alone in a territory she did not understand, that the legal system in Flagstaff ran slowly and expensively, that he had friends in multiple useful positions, and that her best course of action remained accepting his offer and returning to wherever she had come from. She told him she would think about it and left the meeting with steady hands and a heartbeat that would not slow down for 40 minutes. That evening, she rode to the Garrison Ranch in the late afternoon heat, later than she usually arrived, and found Martin at the end of the day putting tools away in the barn. She told him what Colton had said. She said it plainly without theater because she was tired and she trusted him and she needed to think out loud with someone she trusted. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He will not move against you legally. He cannot, not with the documentation you now have." "What will he move against me with?" Martin looked at her steadily. "Pressure. He will try to make staying difficult. Talk to Clara Hinz about your room or to Reed Halsey about the supply wagon you use. Small things. He wants you uncomfortable and isolated. You know him well. I know his methods. He tried them with my father before my father died. The goal is always to make you feel that fighting costs more than it is worth. Does it? He considered the question seriously rather than reassuring her with easy words, which she had already learned was his way. For most people who come through here without connection, without roots, yes, he is usually correct in that calculation. He paused. But you are not leaving. It was not phrased as a question, and it stopped her. She realized she was looking at him, and she could not immediately determine what was in his expression, only that something was there that she hadn't seen before, something careful and restrained and nevertheless present. "No," she said quietly, "I am not leaving." What Martin Garrison did next was something she would revisit many times in the weeks that followed. He said, "Then we handle it together," with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything, as though it were obvious, as though it had already been decided, and then he went back to putting away his tools. Together turned out to mean something substantial. Martin had his own grievances with Dale Colton, old ones, stretching back to the early years of the Garrison Ranch, when Colton had attempted to acquire water rights on the western branch of Reed Rock Creek through a combination of bureaucratic pressure and outright false filing. Martin had defeated that attempt through documentation and patience, and he had maintained a detailed record of Colton's boundary violations and grazing right abuses ever since, the kind of comprehensive file that a careful man keeps not because he expects to need it, but because he understands that the difference between having it and not having it is the difference between being prepared and being vulnerable. He offered Ella use of that record. She stared at him. "You have been keeping this for 8 years. Longer. My father started it. And you are willing to let me use it in a dispute with Colton. Your dispute and mine are the same dispute. He wants the creek access that your parcel controls. If he gets it, it changes the water balance of this whole valley in his favor. That is not in my interest or anyone else's interest but his." She understood all of this perfectly well. She understood it was rational and mutually advantageous. She also understood that a man who had been keeping careful documentation for 8 years, and who could have used it himself before this point, had not yet had a reason that justified the attention it would draw, and that she had just become that reason. She was not sure how to feel about that. She thought about it late that night in her small room at Clara Hint's boarding house, listening to the wind moving outside and watching the moon cross the square of her westward-facing window. The pressure Colton applied was real but manageable. He spoke to Clara Hint, who told Ella about it herself with a forthright directness that Ella appreciated enormously, and said that she had declined to make any changes to Ella's tenancy because she ran her house according to her own judgment and not Dale Colton's. He spoke to Reed Halsey, who was less resolute but who also, it turned out, had his own complicated history with Colton involving a disputed cattle purchase from 3 years prior, and who ultimately continued to allow Ella use of his wagon. Colton's social pressure moved through the town like water finding the path of least resistance, and wherever it found resistance, it moved around without disappearing. Martin had been correct about the method. Ella found, however, that the isolation Colton was engineering did not take root the way it might have if she had been a different kind of person. She was not by nature someone who required a large social circle. She had her practical alliances with Clara and Arlene Potts and the lawyer Stills. And she had Martin. The realization of how central he had become to her daily existence arrived one afternoon when she rode out to find the ranch gate shut, and a note indicating he had ridden to Flagstaff on cattle business and would be back in 3 days. She stood at the gate looking at the note for longer than the situation required, and what she felt was something she had not felt in a long time, not simple loneliness but the specific absence of a particular person, which is a very different and more pointed thing. She rode back to town and spent 3 days being extremely productive in various ways and thinking about Martin Garrison more than was reasonable. He returned on the 4th day. She was at the general store when she saw him ride past on the main street, and she stayed carefully in the store until he had passed, and then did not go to the ranch for 2 more days, which she told herself was entirely reasonable, and which fooled no one, least of all herself. When she did go, there was an ease between them that hadn't quite been there before his absence, the way that a space becomes most visible exactly when something is removed from it. They walked the fence line between her uncle's parcel and his property, ostensibly checking for a section of fence she thought needed repair, and they talked more than they usually did. He told her about Flagstaff, about the conversations he had with the cattle buyers and the state of the market, and she told him about the response she had received from the Flagstaff Land Office judge regarding Colton's improper filing from 2 years prior. They spoke about practical things. The conversation had underneath it a current of something else that neither of them addressed directly. The fence section did need repair. They fixed it together, working in easy parallel in the late afternoon heat, and when they finished and stood back looking at the mended line, she was aware of how close he was standing and of the quality of the light on everything and of the way she felt, which was something she had not felt in a very long time, comfortable and safe and present and wanting. She did not say any of this. He did not say anything either. She rode back to town at dusk, and the western sky was extraordinary, layers of color moving from gold to deep red to purple at the edges, and she understood for the first time that it was like this every evening, that this was what the view from her westward-facing window was trying to show her every night, and that she had been too busy or too distracted or too careful to simply stop and receive it. The legal situation resolved in early May, approximately 5 weeks after her arrival. The Flagstaff Land Office judge, presented with Martin's compiled documentation of Colton's boundary violations and Ella's evidence of the uncredited payment, ruled in a letter to Grover Stills that the outstanding note must be recalculated, that the creek grazing rights were not legally assignable under the terms of the original sale, and that Colton's prior filings regarding water rights access were to be formally reviewed by the Territorial Land Commission. It was not everything. Colton retained his political connections and his wealth and his considerable range. But the specific trap he had set for Ella Mercer was dismantled, the debt renegotiated to a figure she could pay with her remaining funds and a reasonable installment arrangement, and the 47 acres were unambiguously hers. She sat in Grover Stills's office reading the letter, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding tight since St. Louis. Not all of it. She was realistic about how much of the tight, held quality in her chest was Victor Harlan and how much was Colton, and only the Colton portion had just been resolved. But it was enough. It was a foothold. It was, for the first time since she had fled St. Louis with her careful money and her careful fear, something that was hers and could not be easily taken. She rode to the Garrison ranch to tell Martin before she told anyone else. She found him at the house this time rather than the field, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and some papers he was reading, and when she rode up and told him what the judge had ruled, she watched something move in his expression that she had not quite seen there before. Not relief, exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like satisfaction, the particular quality of it that comes when something you have worked toward comes out right. "Your uncle would have been glad," he said. She hadn't expected that, and she felt it unexpectedly. "I didn't know him well, we only met twice. He sent letters. He mentioned you in them, said you were the sharp one." She looked at him. "He talked about me to you?" "We talked. He was a good man who got tangled up in something bigger than he could manage alone. I tried to help where I could." A pause. "I think he was glad there was someone who would come for the land, someone who wouldn't just let Colton have it." The specific meaning of that, the idea that her uncle had hoped for her, had perhaps believed she would come, made her chest ache in a way she was not entirely prepared for. She pressed it down with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has learned not to let herself fall apart in public. "Thank you," she said, "for the records, for all of it." "You did the work," he said simply, "not alone." He looked at her for a moment with those direct, unperforming eyes, and said nothing, and she felt the thing between them with uncomfortable clarity, the thing she had been not looking at for weeks, hovering in the air between them like the heat that rose from the red earth in the middle of the day. Then Dale Colton's shadow came across them again, and not metaphorically. 2 days after the ruling, something happened that changed the quality of the danger Ella was carrying. A man she did not recognize came to Clara Hind's boarding house asking for her while she was at the general store, and when Clara described him later, the description fit a type of man that Ella recognized from St. Louis with a sharp, cold certainty. He was not local. He wore a coat that was too heavy for Arizona spring. He had a particular quality of stillness about him, not Martin's kind of stillness, which was peace, but the other kind, the kind that is coiled. She knew, with a knowledge that lived below thought, that this was Victor Harlan's reach extending itself westward. She had known, in the careful, logical part of her mind, that Victor would not simply let her go. He was not a man who tolerated defiance, and leaving had been the most visible defiance she had ever offered him. She had hoped that distance would buy time, that by the time he located her, she would have the land and the legal standing, and perhaps the means to make herself difficult to dislodge. What she had not fully calculated was how quickly a man with money and underworld connections could have someone track a woman who had, after all, traveled by public stage. She sat in her room at Clara's and thought about this with the kind of focused, systematic clarity that she was capable of when panic was not an option, and panic was not an option. She thought about telling Martin. She had not told him about Victor Harlan. She had not told anyone about Victor Harlan. It was a habit of self-protection so ingrained that the idea of saying it out loud felt like removing a layer of armor in a situation where she was not sure the rest of the armor was sufficient. But she also understood, with the same systematic clarity, that she was navigating the Victor Harlan problem alone in the same way she had tried to navigate the Dale Colton problem alone, and that it had been Martin's intervention, his records, his knowledge of the valley that had made the Colton situation manageable. She had a collaborator, an honest one, and this problem was no smaller than the last one. She went to the ranch the following morning and she told him. She sat across from him at the kitchen table in his farmhouse, which she had never been inside before, and she told him about Victor Harlan in the same plain, factual way she had told him about the Colton situation, because layering it in emotion would not help either of them think clearly. She told him about the engagement, about discovering who Victor was, about the morning she had left, about the bruising on her wrist, about the fear that had driven her 600 miles from everything she knew. She told him about the man who had come asking for her at Clara's. When she finished, Martin was very still. The stillness had a different quality now, compressed and taut. "Did Clara tell him you were here?" he said. She told him she had no guess by that name. He was quiet for a moment. "Did you believe her?" "Yes, Clara is not a woman who frightens easily or lies clumsily." "How long has this man Harlan been looking for you?" "I don't know, at least weeks. The man at Clara's could have arrived sooner and waited to approach, or he could have arrived just recently. I have no way to know." Martin stood up from the table and walked to the window, and she watched him think, which was visible in him not as visible agitation, but as a particular quality of focused attention directed inward. "Stay here," he said. "Martin, not forever. Tonight. And tomorrow we work out what comes after." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "You came to me with the Colton problem. You were right to come to me with this one. I am not asking you to be helpless. I am asking you to not be alone while someone dangerous is looking for you in a town where you currently live, with no other protection." She looked back at him, and she felt the competing pulls of the self-sufficiency that had kept her alive this far and the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying everything alone. And she thought about the man at Clara's, and about Victor Harlan's cold voice the last time she had heard it, and she said, "All right." She sent word to Clara Hind's through one of the ranch hands, a grizzled man named Joe Prout who had worked the Garrison land for years, and who seemed to understand without being told that discretion was required. Clara sent back Ella's traveling bag with a note that said simply, "I told anyone who asks that you have left Cascade Flats." Ella had not known she could feel grateful and frightened, and something else altogether at the same time until that note arrived. She stayed at the Garrison Ranch in the small spare room off the kitchen, which had a narrow bed and a window that faced south, and she was there for 4 days while Martin made careful, quiet inquiries through the network of connections that a man who has been in the same territory for 8 years accumulates. The man who had come to Clara's had taken a room at the Copper Crown Saloon and had been asking general questions about the area, about people, without appearing to zero in on any specific target. He had not given his name freely, but someone had overheard him in conversation, and the name attached to him was Prentice, not Harlan, but the connection, through a network of acquaintance that Martin was able to trace because he knew the valley like a map, led back to the kind of St. Louis business association that Victor Harlan maintained. Martin told her this on the second evening in the kitchen while they were eating supper that he had cooked with the same practical thoroughness he applied to everything, and the specific knowledge of it landed in her chest like a weight. It was confirmation. Victor had sent someone. The trap she had fled had folded itself into her luggage and followed her west. "He cannot have you removed from the territory," Martin said. "This is not St. Louis. Harlan's connections do not extend to the territorial structure in a way that would allow legal leverage." "Victor does not only use legal leverage," she said. Martin looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "I expect not. I am not afraid for myself in the way I was afraid of him in St. Louis," she said carefully, and she meant it. The specific fear she had carried from St. Louis was the fear of a woman with no recourse, alone in a city where the man pursuing her had people in useful positions. Here the equation was different. She had the land. She had the legal standing she had fought for. She had Martin. She was not going back. "But I do not underestimate what he will send after what he believes belongs to him." "Then we make it clear," Martin said quietly, "that you do not belong to anyone." She looked at him, and something in the particular way he said it, the precise word choice, the understated conviction of it, hit her somewhere central, and she felt it move through her like a current. The resolution of the Prentice problem was not dramatic. Martin rode to the Copper Crown the following afternoon, alone, and Ella did not ask in advance what he planned to do. She trusted his judgment with a totality that would have alarmed her 2 months prior. He came back 3 hours later and said that he had a conversation with Prentice, and that Prentice had been made to understand several things. That the woman he was inquiring about had legal standing on land in this territory, that the Territorial Cattle Ranchers Association, of which Martin was a sitting member, had relationships with the Territory Marshal's office, and that any attempt to pressure, coerce, or remove a landowner of record would be documented and reported to the Marshal. He had also mentioned, factually and without threat, the specific documentation he maintained regarding various legal matters in the valley, and had noted that such documentation could, if relevant, be made available to territorial authorities in connection with any investigation that might arise. Prentice had paid his room at the Copper Crown and left Cascade Flats on the morning stage. Ella stood on the porch of the Garrison farmhouse and listened to Martin report this, and felt the particular, expansive sensation of a fear that has been carried so long it has become structural, finally releasing from the body. "He will tell Victor," she said. "He will tell Victor," Martin agreed. "He will also tell him what responding to this situation would cost in terms of the kinds of attention Victor Harlan does not want from territorial authorities. Men like Harlan depend on invisibility." He paused. "You are not invisible. You have land and legal standing and people who know you are here. That changes the calculation." She was quiet for a long moment. The late afternoon was settling into the particular gold of the hour before dusk, and the air smelled of dry grass and the faint mineral smell of the high desert, and she thought about Victor Harlan in St. Louis receiving Prentice's report and doing precisely the calculation Martin described, and she thought that Martin was probably right, that she had made herself enough of a known entity in a public enough way that Victor would find the cost of pursuing her greater than she was worth to his particular kind of pride. She thought she was free. She thought, I do not want to leave here. She was standing on Martin Garrison's porch thinking that she did not want to leave, and the realization moved through her slowly, and then all at once, with the particular quality of something that has been true for a while before you are willing to name it. It was not about the land, not only. It was not about safety, not primarily. It was about this place and the red earth and the enormous sky and the way Martin looked at her, and the way the silence around him felt like something she wanted to live inside. She was frightened by this. Not the fear of danger, but the more complex fear of wanting something genuinely after spending years managing distance from wanting anything too much, because wanting too much made you vulnerable, and vulnerability was the thing that Victor Harlan had tried to use against her. She had learned to hold herself carefully. She did not know how to stop. The fourth evening, she was standing at the fence at the western edge of the property, where the land fell away toward a broad view of the valley and the mesa beyond, and the sun was dropping toward the horizon in the particular way it did in northern Arizona, not quickly but with a deliberate, painted quality, as though it were aware of its own drama. She had been watching it for 20 minutes. She heard Martin come up behind her, and then he was standing beside her, and they watched it together in the silence that was his natural medium. She did not know how long they stood there. Long enough for the colors to change completely, from gold to orange to the deep, bleeding red that preceded violet. And Martin said, quietly and without drama, without preparation or preamble, as though it were something he had thought about many times and was now simply, finally saying, I have watched that sunset every night alone until you stood here. And that was the moment she had nearly left, had nearly robbed herself of by packing her trunk at dawn and climbing into Reed Halsey's wagon and choosing the safer, smaller version of her life over the terrifying, expansive one. She did not turn to look at him immediately. She stood still with his words inside her chest and felt them settle, felt their weight, understood their cost. This was not a man who said things easily. This was a man who said things once and meant them completely. 6 words, the exact ones, the only ones he needed, and they carried 8 years of evenings in them. 8 years of solitude that he had made something purposeful, but that was still, underneath all the purposefulness, alone. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon, jaw set, the posture of a man who has said the true thing and is now waiting to discover whether the world will honor it or not. She said, Martin. He looked at her. She said, I almost left this morning. Something moved in his face. I know, Joe Prout saw the light in your room very early. I was packing. I know, he said again. I stopped because she stopped. She started again. I stopped because I was afraid I was becoming someone who needed too much and I do not have a good history with. She stopped again. With trusting people, he said quietly. With trusting men who say things I want to hear. He held her gaze. I have never said anything to you that was designed to be what you wanted to hear. I am not capable of that. I say what is true. Sometimes that is useful and sometimes it is not what anyone wants to hear at all. She knew this. She knew it in her bones, had known it since the first week, that the specific quality of Martin Garrison's speech was the opposite of Victor Harlan's. Victor had been fluent in what people wanted, had constructed sentences like architecture designed to produce specific emotional responses. Martin said what was and left you to do with it what you would. I know that about you, she said. Then you know I mean it, that I have been here alone, that you changed something. A pause. I am not asking you to commit to something before you are ready. I am only asking you to know that I mean what I said. She looked at him for a long moment in the last of the sunset light, and she felt the careful, self-protective structure she had maintained for 2 years beginning to come apart at the joints, not catastrophically, not all at once, but in the way of something that has served its purpose and can now be set down. She said, "I stopped packing this morning because I realized I did not want to leave. Not the land. You." The expression that moved across his face was not what she expected. It was not triumph or relief, or the particular satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted. It was something quieter and more vulnerable than any of those, something that looked precisely like a man who has been alone for a long time and has just been seen. He reached out and took her hand. He did it the way he did everything, slowly and deliberately and without performance, and his hand was large and calloused and warm from the sun-kept day, and she held on. They stayed at the fence for a long time, until the last of the color had gone from the sky and the first stars were beginning to appear in the east, and neither of them said much of anything, and it was the most honest conversation Ella Mercer had ever had. That was the beginning of the part she had not planned for, the part she had not allowed herself to plan for because planning for it would have required admitting she wanted it, and she was still learning to want things freely. What followed in the weeks after that evening was a courtship of unusual character. It was slow in the ways that mattered and quick in the ways that were already decided. Martin was not a man who rushed, and Ella was a woman who needed to trust her own judgment before she trusted anything else, and so they proceeded at a pace that honored both of those things. But the essential truth of the thing, which was that they had already decided, already been moving toward this for weeks without naming it, meant that there was an ease to it that she had never experienced in the process of caring for someone. He rode into town with her on market day, and they walked through the general store, and Arlene Potts watched them with a satisfaction so open it was nearly comic, and Clara Hinds said nothing but squeezed Ella's hand when she came home that evening. The town of Cascade Flats, which was small enough to notice and informal enough to not require formal announcement, understood the situation within about a week, which was approximately the pace at which Martin began riding into town twice a week instead of once, and which Ella had stopped pretending was about anything other than her. Dale Colton made one more approach in this period, a calculated one, coming to the Garrison ranch on a morning when he had reason to believe Ella would be there. He sat across from both of them on the porch and offered, with the polished smoothness of a man who was recalibrating his strategy, a formal grazing agreement that would give him the creek access he needed in exchange for a fair annual payment. He addressed the offer primarily to Ella as the landowner of record, and he was carefully courteous to Martin, which told Ella everything she needed to know about where he now estimated the power in the room resided. She listened to his offer and asked specific questions about terms and payment structure, and Martin said very little but sat with the quiet, unignorable presence of a man who is prepared for whatever answer is given, and Dale Colton understood that whatever Ella decided, she was not deciding it alone, and that the leverage of isolation that he had been counting on was simply no longer available to him. Ella told him she would take the proposed agreement to Grover Stills for review, and if the terms were fair, she would sign it. She said this pleasantly, and she meant it, because she was not a woman who pursued conflict for its own sake, and a fair grazing agreement with reasonable payment was in her economic interest. She just wanted it to be a fair agreement, not a capitulation. It was, after Stills reviewed it, a fair agreement. She signed it. Colton got his creek access on a seasonal basis. She got the income, and both parties had something they could work with. It was not a warm resolution, but frontier life was full of pragmatic arrangements between people who would never particularly like each other, and this was one of them. Martin said afterward, "Your uncle would have been even more glad." She laughed, which surprised them both a little, and he looked at her when she laughed with the expression she had begun to recognize as the one he kept most carefully guarded, the one that was undisguised and soft and entirely his. Autumn came to the high desert with the particular drama of the season change at elevation, the days remaining warm and the nights dropping sharply, the light taking on a golden horizontal quality that made everything look like a painting of itself. The land was extraordinary in this light, and Ella's cabin on her uncle's parcel, which she had been slowly and carefully making habitable through a summer of repairs, she had managed mostly herself with occasional help from Martin and Joe Prout, was beginning to look like somewhere a person might actually choose to live rather than merely survive. Martin came to help with the window repairs one October afternoon, which was practical enough, and stayed for supper, which was also practical enough, and stayed past supper to sit by the fire she had built against the desert autumn evening, which was less practical and entirely welcome. They talked for hours that night, which was unusual for him and felt significant because of it. He talked about his father, who had come to Arizona from Missouri in 1865 with a land grant and an absolute determination to build something that would last. He talked about the years after his father's death, the weight of running the ranch alone at 22, the decisions he had made wrong and the ones he had made right, the education of failure, and the specific loneliness of a kind of life that was satisfying in its work and empty in its hours. She talked about her mother, who had died when Ella was 19, and about the years incent. Louis that had felt increasingly confined and increasingly wrong until Victor Harlan had appeared and seemed briefly and catastrophically like the kind of wrong thing you could confuse for right. She talked about that with a clarity she had not had before on the subject, the clarity that comes from distance and safety, and she found that saying it out loud to Martin, who listened with his whole attention and no visible judgment, relieved it of some of the shame she had been carrying. "You were not stupid," he said. "He was practiced. I should have seen it sooner. Perhaps, or perhaps you saw it exactly when it was possible to see it and acted as quickly as it was safe to act." He looked at her directly. "You got yourself out, that was not nothing." She held that. "No," she said after a moment. "It was not nothing." He reached across and touched her face very gently with the back of one hand, and she leaned into it slightly, and he said nothing and neither did she, and the fire made its sounds in the evening quiet. He asked her to marry him in November, which was a month that smelled of wood smoke and dry sage, and he asked her in the way she should have known he would, plainly and completely, sitting at his kitchen table over coffee on a Tuesday morning with no particular ceremony. He said, "I want to ask you to marry me. I want you to know I am asking because I have thought about it since June, and I believe we are better together than either of us is separately, not because I think you need me, because I think you do not, but because I want to build something with you, and I think you might want that too." She looked at him for a long moment over her coffee. She thought about June, which had been her second week in Cascade Flats, which had been before she had unpacked her trunk entirely, which was much further back than she had expected. She said, "I have wanted to be asked since August." He looked at her. Something moved in his eyes that was, she was fairly certain, the closest to openly happy she had ever seen him. "That is 3 months I did not know I had," he said. "3 months you spent being extremely careful and respectful," she said. "I was not certain you wanted to be asked. Martin, I stayed at this ranch for 4 days while you managed a threat to my safety. I did not stay in the spare room and cook you breakfast every morning because I was uncertain." The almost smile arrived. "No," he said. "I suppose not." She said yes, and it was the easiest yes she had ever said. They were married in February 1883, in the church with the crooked steeple, on a morning when the high desert air was cold and crystal clear, and the light was the particular winter light of Arizona that has an edge to it like glass. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Cascade Flats twice a season, and the witnesses were Clara Hinds and Grover Stills and Arlene Potts and Joe Prout, who looked profoundly uncomfortable in a clean shirt and deeply moved by the proceedings. Ella wore the blue dress she had bought in Flagstaff the previous month on a trip she had told Martin was for cattle business, which he had accepted without comment but with the specific quality of the almost smile. She had her mother's cameo brooch at her collar, and her hair pinned more carefully than usual. Martin wore his best suit, which was dark wool and fit him better than she had expected, and he looked at her when she walked into the church with the expression she had stopped trying to protect herself from, the one that was undisguised and soft. The vows were the traditional ones, which suited them both because they meant them literally. They moved into the Garrison farmhouse together, consolidating what had been her cabin's function into the larger operation of his, though she kept the cabin on her parcel and used it for storage and, eventually, for something else entirely. The ranch itself expanded modestly over that first year, Martin taking on 2 additional hands in the spring and adding a section of grazing land to the north that had come available when the previous owner moved to California. Ella kept the grazing agreement with Colton, renegotiating the terms at the annual renewal with a precision that Grover Stills described as formidable, and used the income to fund improvements to the cabin property. She also began to learn the cattle business in earnest. She had come to it from the outside, as necessity rather than affinity, but she found, over months of working alongside Martin and listening and asking questions, and making mistakes and learning from them, that she had a genuine aptitude for the financial and logistical aspects of ranching that complemented Martin's mastery of the land and livestock sides in a way that was practically useful and personally satisfying. Martin recognized this without being asked to and gave her increasing responsibility for the operations accounts and marketing relationships, not because he needed help, but because she was genuinely good at it, and because he was a man who recognized capacity and respected it. Their first winter together on the ranch was hard in the practical ways that first winters in new configurations tend to be, cold and demanding and educational, and was also the best winter of Ella Mercer Garrison's life. She came into her own understanding of what it meant to be partnered, not with someone who had a dark motive or a hidden agenda, or who treated her as a possession with a pleasant surface, but with someone who was simply, honestly, present. She learned Martin in the way that takes time, in the accumulation of small things, the way he woke earlier than she did, and had the fire going before she came into the kitchen, the particular way he looked at the horizon when he was thinking, the rare and valuable sound of his laugh, which was low and came from somewhere real. She learned that he had been more frightened on the night he told her about the sunset than he had let appear, that the words had cost him more than her, not because he was afraid of her rejection, but because he was a man who protected himself in the only way such men know how, by not saying the things that could be rejected until the saying of them became unavoidable. She learned this from Joe Prout, who had worked the Garrison land for 6 years and who told her over a mended fence one afternoon, with the forthright sentimentality of old ranch hands, that he had never seen Martin smile the way he did now, and that he had worried about the man in the years before, the particular, quiet, grinding way of a person who is doing fine and not quite living. She tucked that away and held it carefully, the way you hold something precious. They had their first child in the autumn of 1883, a boy they named Francis Martin Garrison, Francis for her uncle and Martin for his father both, and he arrived in the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn quality of attention, and a pair of lungs that Joe Prout said he could hear from the barn. Martin held him for the first time with the particular stillness of a man who has been struck completely, not by surprise, but by the magnitude of something he had perhaps known was coming and found, in the arrival, was larger than expectation. Ella watched him hold their son, and felt something complete itself in her chest that she had not known was unfinished. Life at the Garrison Ranch in those years had the character that all good lives have, which is the character of variety and progression, and the continuous arrival of both small joys and manageable difficulties. The cattle operation grew steadily, not dramatically, but with the consistent, reliable pace of something built on solid foundation rather than speculation. Martin's reputation in the valley, which had always been one of integrity, expanded as the ranch's success became more visible, and he was elected to the Cascade Flats Town Council in 1884, which he accepted with less enthusiasm than the town had hoped for, but which he fulfilled with the thoroughness he brought to all his commitments. Ella built something else alongside the ranch operation, slower and less expected. She had the cabin on her uncle's parcel, and she used it initially for storage. And then, beginning in the spring of 1884, she used it for something that had begun as a casual arrangement and became a sustained effort. There were children in Cascade Flats who had no school, the nearest one being in Flagstaff, too far for daily attendance and too expensive for most families to arrange boarding. Ella had been educated in St. Louis at the kind of school available to middle-class families with intellectual ambitions, and she had the books and the patience and the particular quality of attention that made her, it turned out, an effective teacher. She started with 4 children, the children of ranch hands and town residents whose parents were glad of any arrangement. Within a year, she had 12. By 1885, she had petitioned the Territorial Education Board for formal recognition and received it, and the cabin on the Mercer parcel became, officially, the Cascade Flats District School. Ella Garrison, teacher of record. Martin built her a proper school building on the parcel the following summer, expanded from the cabin, with space for 20 students and a potbelly stove for the cold months, and 2 rows of proper desks that had been ordered from a manufacturer in Flagstaff. He built it himself with 2 of the ranch hands and Joe Prout, and he did not mention until the building was finished that it had taken him through 3 weekends of extra work over the course of the summer. Information Ella extracted from Joe because Martin would not have volunteered it. She walked through the finished school building on the morning he showed it to her, touching the smooth desktop surfaces and the window frames he had fitted carefully to keep out the desert wind. And she came back to the doorway where he was waiting with his hat in his hands, and she kissed him in the clear morning sunlight in a way that made Joe Prout, who was unfortunately within sight of the doorway, look pointedly at the middle distance. Their second child arrived in 1886, a girl they named Clara Frances. Clara for the woman whose straightforward loyalty had sheltered Ella in her most uncertain days, and Frances again, because the name had taken on weight in their family. Clara Frances had her mother's green eyes and her father's patience, and a personality that announced itself early as interested in everything and deferential to nothing, which both of her parents found secretly delightful and publicly challenging. Dale Colton died in 1886 of a heart condition that had been, his family announced, a private struggle for some years. He left behind a large operation and a complicated legacy, and 2 sons who ran the Colton Cattle Company with considerably less political cunning than their father, and therefore less trouble to everyone around them. The grazing agreement between the Mercer parcel and the Colton operation continued under the new management because it made economic sense to everyone, and the specific quality of tension that had characterized Ella's early months in Cascade Flats dissipated without ceremony. Victor Harlan never came to Arizona territory. The threat he had sent in the person of Prentice had accomplished nothing, and the calculation Martin had predicted him making had apparently produced, as predicted, the conclusion that pursuing Ella into a place where she had land and legal standing and visible connections was not worth the exposure. Ella received confirmation of this, in a sideways fashion, through a letter from a former acquaintance in St. Louis in 1885, who mentioned casually that Victor Harlan had married the daughter of a shipping magnate and was apparently occupied with new pursuits. She read this letter sitting at the kitchen table in the Garrison farmhouse with little Frances playing on the floor near her feet, and she felt the last of the cold weight she had carried from St. Louis dissolve like morning frost. She told Martin about the letter that evening. He listened and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Good," with the particular Garrison precision that meant he had considered the range of possible responses, and found that word covered everything necessary. She laughed and he did too, low and real, and Francis looked up from the floor and laughed along with them, because he was 2 years old and laughter was contagious. And it was one of those evenings that does not look significant from the outside, but that Ella would remember with exact clarity for the rest of her life. Their third child, a boy named Thomas James Garrison, arrived in 1888. He was fair where the other two were dark, and quiet where Clara Francis was constant noise, and he took to the land with an instinctive ease that made Martin look at him, sometimes, with the particular expression Ella had learned to read as recognition. The ranch by this time had doubled in effective acreage through a combination of purchase and strategic lease agreement, and Ella had reorganized the bookkeeping in a way that reduced their operational inefficiencies significantly, and which Martin acknowledged with the specific quality of being impressed that he expressed by asking her detailed questions about how she had done it and implementing all of her suggestions without argument. She ran the school for 23 students by this point, with a second teacher she had trained herself, a young woman from the territory who had come through Cascade Flats on her way somewhere else and stayed, which Ella understood as a pattern she had personal familiarity with. The town of Cascade Flats itself grew in those years, as the territory grew, not dramatically but steadily. A doctor arrived in 1887 and set up a practice next to the general store, which Arlene Potts expressed satisfaction about in the particular dry fashion that was her style. The church had its steeple straightened in 1888, finally, a project that Martin served on the committee for without complaint, and which Ella suspected he had actually enjoyed in the particular Garrison way of things done right. A second teacher for the school arrived in 1889, allowing Ella to manage the administration of the institution rather than teaching all subjects herself, which freed time she devoted in roughly equal portions to the ranch accounts and to the family, and to reading on winter evenings by the fire in the farmhouse. The farmhouse itself had been added to over the years, a new room here, an expanded kitchen there, the kind of organic growth that happens to a structure when it needs to contain more life than it was originally designed for. Martin had built the additions himself or overseen them closely, with the same quality of attention to doing things properly that characterized everything he touched. The house was not elegant by the standards of city architecture, but it was solid and proportioned and full of light in the afternoons, because Martin had been deliberate about window placement, and it was, entirely and undeniably, a home. On an evening in October 1889, 7 years after Ella Mercer had stepped off the stage in Cascade Flats with a satchel and a letter and trouble following her shadow, she stood at the western fence of the Garrison property with Martin beside her, and watched the sun go down over the Arizona Mesa country. The 3 children were behind them at the house with Clara Hinds, who had become, in the years of this life that had accumulated itself, something functionally indistinguishable from their children's grandmother. The evening air smelled of the dry sage and the cooling red earth and the faint, particular quality of autumn in the high desert. The sunset was doing what it always did, which was to be extraordinary without apology, moving through gold and orange and the deep painted red that became violet at the edges, and the two of them stood watching it with the ease of people who have stood in this particular place together many times. She said, "Do you remember what you said to me the first evening we stood here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Were you afraid when you said it?" He considered this. "I was careful when I said it." "There is a difference." "What is the difference?" "Fear is about protecting yourself. Careful is about honoring what is true." He paused. "I had been careful with it for a long time. I had watched that sunset alone for 8 years before you were there. By the time I said it, the saying of it was honest, and the honesty was not something I was willing to hold back anymore." She took his hand, his large, calloused, warm hand that she had held 10,000 times and which still felt like holding something real. "I almost did not let you say it," she said. "I know. Joe told me you were packing. Joe tells you everything. Joe is an excellent ranch hand and an appalling keeper of secrets." She smiled. They were quiet for a while, watching the sky move through its colors. "I have thought about who I would have been," she said, "if I had gotten into Reed Halsey's wagon that morning, who we would not have been." "I think about it too," he said, "less than I used to." "Why less?" He looked at her. "Because you did not get in the wagon, because you are standing here. Because the thing that almost did not happen did happen, and the thing that is true now is this." He gestured slightly, encompassing the landscape and the house behind them and the evening and the 7 years. "What almost was is not what is." She looked at him and felt the familiar movement of that undisguised soft expression that he showed her only when they were alone, or when they thought no one was looking, or when he had stopped caring whether anyone was. "You are more philosophical this evening than usual," she said. "I have been informed by Clara Francis that she intends to become a doctor," he said. "She is 3 years old. She told me this morning with complete certainty." Ella laughed. "She saw Dr. Whitmore last week when Thomas had his cough. She asked him 14 questions. He answered all of them. She told me his knowledge was acceptable." She laughed again, and he laughed, and the sound of it went out into the desert evening, where the first stars were just beginning to suggest themselves at the edge of the darkening east. The sunset was fading now, the last of the color deepening to the particular twilight purple of the high desert sky just before the dark came on fully, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are yours and you know it. Francis came running from the house across the dry grass, 7 years old and his father's build, and his mother's determination, calling that Clara Hinds said supper was ready and they should come in. Martin turned to scoop him up with the ease of a man who has been doing this for years, and Francis, who was at an age where he wanted to be carried and simultaneously insisted he was too old for it, allowed himself to be carried anyway with a dignity he maintained by immediately demanding to know about the particular shade of the western sky, and why it did that, and whether it was different in winter, and what caused the color. Martin answered every question with the patient, precise quality of a man who actually thinks the questions are worth answering, carrying their son across the field toward the lit windows of the house, and Ella walked beside them in the last of the evening light and listened. She thought about the letter from the lawyer that had arrived in her St. Louis room 2 years before all of this, and how she had read it as a lifeline from a drowning position, as the only practical option available to a woman who needed to be somewhere else. She thought about how she had come to Cascade Flats for reasons of necessity and no other, how she had carried her defenses like a second skin, how she had stood at the western fence for the first time looking at a landscape she did not know and feeling the particular, ground-level question of whether any of this was survivable. She thought about dark eyes that looked at her without performing the act of looking. She thought, "I came here to survive and I stayed here to live, and the distance between those two things is everything." The supper Clara Hinds had made was good. A beef stew with the biscuits that Thomas favored, and a dried apple cake that was Francis's primary reason for remaining on his best behavior through the meal. Clara Francis, 3 years old and immovably certain of her convictions, ate with the focused efficiency of someone with other things to get to, announced that she had decided the steeple of the church was still not quite straight, and was corrected on this point by her father with the information that he had overseen the straightening himself, to which she responded that she would need to see it again tomorrow to be sure, which made Clara Hinds cover a smile with her hand. After supper, when the children were in bed and Clara Hinds had been seen off in the direction of her house in town, Ella and Martin sat on the porch in the cool night air with coffee going cold in their hands and the stars enormous overhead, the way stars are in a place with no competition. She leaned against him, and he shifted his arm to accommodate this in the easy way of long practice, and they sat in the comfortable quiet that was his native element and had become hers. She thought about something she had been thinking about in a quiet, sideways fashion for the past few months, something she had not yet said. She thought about it now and about Martin's voice earlier saying what almost was is not what is, and about the particular rightness of that. She said, "I have been thinking about something." He waited. "The school needs to expand again. Whitmore says the population of the territory is going to keep growing and Cascade Flats is well positioned. If we built a proper schoolhouse, not the converted cabin, a purpose-built structure, we could take 40 students and eventually hire 3 teachers and apply for full district funding." He was quiet for a moment. "That would be a significant undertaking." "Yes, I have been doing the accounts." She paused. "And I have been thinking about going back to Flagstaff for a proper qualification. There is a normal school program there now, a training program for teachers, and if I had the formal credential it would strengthen the funding application." "You are already the best teacher in 3 counties," he said. "I know that," she said without false modesty, because it was true and false modesty wasted time. "The funding board may not. Paper matters." He considered this. She could feel the quality of his thinking in the particular way he breathed when he was working through something real. How long would the program take? 6 weeks in Flagstaff. Joe Prout can manage the ranch, he has done it before. Clara Hines would stay with the children. "Would you want me to come with you?" She turned to look at him. "I thought you could not be away from the cattle operation for 6 weeks. "I cannot be away for 6 weeks, he said. "I could come up twice." She looked at him, this man who measured words carefully and actions the same way, who had said "I could come up twice" as though it were a small thing, and meant by it that he would ride 4 days round trip across the territory twice in 6 weeks, because that was the kind of love that was inconspicuous in its scale. "You do not have to," she said. "I am aware," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would like you to come." He nodded once in the way of a thing decided. She went to Flagstaff the following spring, 1890, for 6 weeks, and came back with the formal credential and a set of books she had found at a Flagstaff printer and a concrete proposal for the new schoolhouse building that she had drafted in the evenings in her rented room. Martin came twice, arriving both times with horses rested at the station and staying 3 days each visit. And on both visits they walked through the city together with the particular quality of people who are from somewhere quieter and do not mind that but are interested in everything anyway. She brought the school proposal back to Cascade Flats and presented it to the town council, on which Martin sat, and she presented it with the careful, factual precision that she had developed in 6 years of managing both a cattle operations accounts and a schoolhouse. And it was funded by a combination of territorial education money and local subscription, the latter organized largely by Arlene Potts, who had a gift for community fundraising that she deployed with quiet ruthlessness. The new schoolhouse was built in 1891, purpose-built, 40 students, 3 teachers eventually, with a proper library room in the back that was Ella's particular pride. Martin did not build this one himself, because the operation was now larger than a farmhouse addition and required an actual contractor from Flagstaff. But he oversaw it with the same attention to quality, and he made sure the windows were right. The day it opened, in the September of 1891, Ella stood in the front room and looked at the clean desks and the proper chalkboard and the rows of books in their cases, and felt the particular satisfaction of something built from intention, from the idea of what a place could be if someone decided it was worth the effort. Martin was behind her. She heard him come in. "Your uncle would have been glad," he said. She turned and looked at him, and she thought about the first time he had said that, sitting on the porch of the ranch that first afternoon she had come to him with her practical problem and her careful pride, and she thought about how far this moment was from that one, and how directly it ran from it in a line she could trace clearly now. "He would," she said. Martin looked around the room with the evaluating look of a man who has been involved in the construction and is checking it with the same eye he checks fence lines, thorough and without sentimentality. Then he looked at her. "You built this," he said, "from 47 acres of debt." "From 47 acres of debt and some extremely valuable assistance," she said. "You are generous in your accounting. I am accurate in my accounting. You know I am always accurate. The almost smile arrived. Yes, he said, you are always accurate. She went to him, and he held her in the room that smelled of new wood and chalk and the particular quality of possibility that the best buildings hold. And outside through the proper windows the September light was golden on the red earth of Cascade Flats. And somewhere on the far side of town, the Garrison ranch sat solid on its land with the children in it, and Joe Pruitt at the fence, and the westward view from the edge of the property that blazed every evening in its colors. Thomas James Garrison, the quiet one, the fair one who had taken to the land early, was 9 years old in 1897, and had already demonstrated that he would inherit the ranch in some form that made practical sense for everyone, not because he was designated or because his parents expected it, but because he had an instinctive relationship to the land that reminded everyone who knew them of his father at a similar age. According to the older residents of Cascade Flats, who had known the Garrison family for 20 years. Francis, at 14, had his mother's relationship to numbers and an additional aptitude for language that his parents suspected would eventually take him somewhere beyond Cascade Flats, and they held this thought with the particular combination of pride and preemptive grief that parents carry about children who are destined for places you cannot follow. Clara Francis, at 11, had not abandoned her intention to become a doctor, which she had maintained with the focused consistency of a person whose convictions are structural rather than ornamental. Dr. Whitmore had been giving her medical texts to read for 2 years, which she read and returned with annotations, which he found alternately impressive and humbling. Ella was 39 in 1895, and Martin was 43, and they had been married 12 years, and the ranch was a real operation by any honest measure, and the school was one of the best in the Northern Territory by the measure of the Territorial Education Board's assessment. And the town of Cascade Flats had grown to 400 people and was still growing. And the two of them sat at the western fence on a November evening and watched the sunset with the ease of people who have been watching the same thing together for a long time. She had thought in the years just after their wedding that she would eventually stop being surprised by the sunsets, that familiarity would leach them of their daily drama. She had been wrong. The high desert sunset had not become ordinary. It had become, if anything, more something she could not name precisely, more layered, because she had been here long enough to know every variation of it. The winter sunsets that were pale and sharp, the summer ones that were enormous and violent with monsoon cloud, the autumn ones like this one, deep and saturated and moving through colors that had no proper names in common language. She had watched it alongside Martin for 12 years, and it had not become less. I have been thinking, she said, he waited, about the school, about what I would like it to be in 10 years. He waited. I would like to add a secondary course of study, not university level, but something that prepares the older students more seriously for whatever comes after, reading law, accounting, medicine. The territory is going to need these things, and young people here have as much right to them as young people in cities. He was quiet for a moment. You would need more teachers. Yes, I have been corresponding with the normal school in Flagstaff. There are young women coming out of that program who are looking for placements. You have already begun. I have already begun, she agreed. She could feel the quality of his appreciation without him expressing it in words, which she had become expert at reading over 12 years. He was proud of her in the specific way of someone who never doubted what they married but is regularly reminded of exactly what it is. Clara Francis has asked Dr. Whitmore to let her observe a procedure, she said. I know, he told me. What did you tell him? I told him she would be fine and he would be better off for letting her watch. She looked at him. He agreed. He did not argue. A pause. She is my daughter. I know when not to argue. She laughed and leaned against his shoulder and felt the November air moving through the dried grass around them, cold and sage-scented and clean, and the sunset continued to do what it did. She thought about the morning she had almost left. She thought about it the way you think about near misses, with a kind of retrospective vertigo, the full awareness of how close the world had come to being different. She thought about Reed Halsey's wagon and her folded dresses and the 6 words that had stopped her, or not stopped her, because Martin had said those words in the evening, and she had already made her choice by then. She had made her choice at dawn, standing with the dress in her hands, and the choice had been, stay. Not because she had to, not because she had no options, but because she wanted this specific life more than she wanted the safety of leaving it. She had chosen, and everything that had come after was the consequence of that choice. And all of it, the school and the children and the 12 years at this fence, and the sunset she could feel changing against the back of her closed eyelids right now. All of it had grown from a single morning when she put the dress down and stayed. Martin's hand found hers in the evening cold, and she held on, and the sky moved through its final colors above the Arizona Mesa country, and the stars began their appearance in the east the way they always did, one at a time and then all at once, and the air smelled of sage and red earth and the smoke beginning to rise from the farmhouse chimney behind them where Clara Hines was probably telling Thomas to come in from the barn. "Martin," she said. "Ella." She smiled at the way he said her name, the way he always said it, the same as everything else he said, straight and true and meaning exactly what it said. "I am glad I did not get in the wagon." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So am I," in the voice that she had learned to love most among all the registers of his quiet speech, low and certain, and requiring nothing added. She was. She was glad in the full, present, bodily way of someone who is not remembering happiness but currently living it. She was 42 years old in 1898, in the high Arizona desert, on land that was hers and had been fought for honestly, beside a man who had watched the same sunset alone for 8 years until she stood there, and she was home in every sense of the word that had ever meant anything to her. The sunset faded to dark. They stayed at the fence until the stars were fully out, the enormous Arizona stars that you could only see properly in places like this, away from the competition of city light. Then Martin stood, pulling her up gently with him, and they walked back across the dry grass toward the lit windows of the house, shoulder to shoulder, his hand at the small of her back in the familiar way. And inside the house their children were waiting and Clara Hines had made supper, and the fire was going against the November night, and all of it was exactly as it should be. The school in Cascade Flats eventually became what Ella had planned for it. A 2-level program that prepared its secondary students for territorial examinations and eventual university study in Flagstaff or Tucson. Clara Frances Garrison did become a doctor, one of the few women in Arizona territory to achieve that distinction, doing her medical training in Tucson in 1906 and returning to practice in Cascade Flats where Dr. Whitmore, older now, welcomed her with a relief he did not bother to conceal. Francis Garrison became a lawyer, practicing in Flagstaff as his mother had predicted, and he came home every Christmas and filled the Garrison farmhouse with his city habits and his considerable love for both his parents and his unwillingness to have a straight conversation with either of them when he could have a complicated one, which everyone agreed he had gotten from his mother. Thomas James Garrison took over the day-to-day management of the ranch at 22, exactly as his father had done, and he did it with the same quality of focused, unshowy competence, and Martin, who had never been a man to hold on to things past their time, stepped back from the operation with a grace that his son appreciated, and that Ella knew had cost him more than he would ever say, because the ranch was his life's work, and handing it forward required a particular kind of trust in the forward. They grew older on the Garrison ranch, Ella and Martin, in the way that people grow older when they have built something real together, with the particular quality of people who have arrived somewhere and know it. Their hair went gray, both of them, Martin's first and then Ella's in a way that she thought privately suited her better than the Brown had, and they moved more carefully through the physical work of the life than they once had, and they did not stand at the fence quite every evening as they had when they were young, but they stood there often, often enough, and the sunset continued to perform its daily drama without regard for the years accumulating around it. On an evening in the autumn of 1910, with Martin at 58 and Ella at 54 and 27 years of marriage behind them, they stood at the western fence in the cooling air and watched the sun go down over the Arizona Mesa country with the ease of people who have watched the same thing together so many times that it has become something other than watching, something more like returning to a place that is only real when you are both in it. She took his hand. He held on. The sky blazed and faded, and the stars came out, one at a time and then all at once, and somewhere behind them in the farmhouse Thomas's children, their grandchildren, two boys named James and Robert who had their grandfather's eyes and their grandmother's stubbornness, were making the kind of noise that children make when they are alive and well and not particularly interested in supper. Martin said, without looking away from the horizon, in the voice she loved best, the low, certain voice that required nothing added, "I would watch it every night alone until you stood here, and then I would do it all again." She looked at him. He looked at her. And she thought, as she had thought approximately 10,000 times in the 27 years since she had put down a folded dress and decided to stay, yes, this, exactly this. And the Arizona night came on, large and star-bright and quiet as stone, and the two of them stood in it together, and everything that needed to be resolved had been, and everything that needed to be built had been, and everything that needed to be said had been said in precisely the words it required, and the life they had made was closed around them like a thing that is finished and whole, a thing that holds.